Hey there everybody, it's Jesse, and today I want to do something a little bit different because I noticed that in the run-up to and release of Final Fantasy XVI, there was a small but growing group of people online who began to say that they had problems with this newest release in the famous RPG franchise. This time produced by Creative Business Unit 3, the team behind the extremely popular Final Fantasy XIV MMORPG. And at the time, I felt like I understood. 16 is a different direction for Final Fantasy, and one that some people will either like or not like, and that's totally fine. But over the months leading to release, and with the drop of the demo, and now at launch, that not for me has kind of morphed into a not my Final Fantasy. A sort of catch-all phrase that I think harkens back to what is really a non-existent era where we all knew what Final Fantasy was, and 16? Well, it ain't it. Which is nonsense. There's never been a this is what Final Fantasy is. Every single Final Fantasy game has pushed the boundaries of what the franchise was before, and every single one is different, even if those differences are only in storytelling or world building. So when, for example, I watched SkillUp's review of the game, which, by the way, a good review, dude makes great content, it bugged the hell out of me that the video opened with, "In Square Enix's haste to evolve this franchise into something new, they've left behind far too much that made Final Fantasy Final Fantasy. In trying to reach a new audience, they've left behind the audience that got the franchise to this point." And while most reviews and most players are extremely happy with the game, that's the thing I noticed in most of the negative talk about it, that there's this undercurrent of they've chosen to leave what made Final Fantasy Final Fantasy. They're leaving old fans behind for the new. And look, getting new fans was 100% the goal of Creative Business Unit 3. Yoshida, the producer of this N14, said as much. And I think due to the franchise's history and impact, many players have created their own idea of what Final Fantasy is to them, turning a blind eye to what the series is as a whole. It reminds me of when I was asked to be on a special board for PAX with various other people in the gaming space, and the question they asked us to help them solve was, how can we grow PAX? Because at the moment, our core audience and attendees are getting older, having kids, have less time to come to the show. So how do we grow? And so myself and all the others in the room sat around thinking up all sorts of ways they could do this, offering advice. But the pushback we kept getting was, if we take your advice, we could risk alienating those who already attend. And so the conversation would devolve into, what is the point of having us here if you're afraid to take the big risks? The only way you grow is by doing this. On this very channel, one which I have had probably far too long, I spent 10 years doing Let's Plays. And then the ecosystem changed, and Twitch is where you went to go watch Let's Plays, and YouTube Let's Plays kind of died off unless you had some sort of gimmick or some sort of fun goof thing that you were doing. For the most part, most people didn't want to watch complete Let's Plays on YouTube, especially from someone who, in gaming space or influencer or content creator terms, is an old man. And so I stopped for the most part and instead did more news-related things and videos like this. And yeah, sure, I took a hit at the start. People who had been here for a while were like, this isn't the Jesse I know, not my Jesse. But the channel recovered, it's growing again, and I've never been happier. And that is what's happening to Final Fantasy. In order to keep the franchise around another 30 years, they have to grow and change and become something that more reflects what today's gamers want. And going back to SkillUp's review, just look at the comments. People in the comments are saying, never played a Final Fantasy, but I'm gonna try this one out. And that is a huge victory for Yoshida and Square Enix and everyone involved, no matter what the lineage of Final Fantasy is. And we should talk that lineage, because Final Fantasy is a series that has always been about taking risks. The name Final Fantasy comes partially from the fact that it was Sakaguchi's last attempt, his final risk at creating something before giving up on game dev altogether. But the game was a hit, and each iteration since has taken the same risks. The rest is history, a history worth talking about, because I'm still asking the question, when was Final Fantasy Final Fantasy? And more importantly, how do you even define what that means? Clearly, we're gonna include music. The music has always been amazing in Final Fantasy. The visuals, even back in the Sprite and Mode 7 days, were stunning. Then maybe when you say it's not Final Fantasy, you mean the combat system. How it's not turn-based, or it looks different. You miss the active time battles. which really haven't been a thing since 2001 in Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy 11 and 14 are MMORPGs and have MMORPG-style combat. 12 did away with random encounters and made enemies visible on the map. The active time battle system became the active dimension battle system and introduced gambits. 13 returned to a variant of the ATB system, although with much more button mashing. 15 introduced an action-based system called the Active Cross Battle, which instead of a menu, players mapped buttons on a controller. They're all over the place. And the active time battle system of old wasn't really introduced until Final Fantasy IV and V, and then V had the job system, which was a whole other thing, and then that wasn't in Final Fantasy VI. So I guess then maybe when you're saying it's not your Final Fantasy, you're talking about the setting or the world building. But even there, the games have always pushed the boundaries. Final Fantasy 1 through 5 were fantasy stories set in worlds of castles and crystals, and sure, there were airships and chocobos and moogles, but all of that took time to develop too. There were no chocobos in Final Fantasy 1. The first moogle was in Final Fantasy 3. Final Fantasy 4 was the first time they really started to delve into deep character drama. Final Fantasy 6 was this push into the trope of magic versus technology. 7 then took that concept and ran with it, as technology and its impact on the world played a major role in that storytelling. Hell, you spent the first part of that game in a giant city, dystopian cyberpunk setting, which was shocking at the time. 8 is about teens and floating schools battling other school kids and then witches. 9 is a return to fantasy as a tribute to the games that came before it. And then 10 brings us the world of Blitzball, big cities, and a world that for the first time is kind of modeled off something different compared to the other games, this time being inspired by Southeast Asia. 11 is straight up an old school MMORPG with fantasy tropes abound. 12 is a return to magic versus technology in a vast desert-filled world, echoing more Star Wars than Final Fantasy. 13, 1, 2, and 3 are straight up anime as hell and set in a semi-futuristic world. And 15 is literally 4 dudes pushing a car to the song Stand By Me. And I saved 14 for last since it's ongoing, and honestly, since Yoshida produces this game as well, it makes sense to save this for the end of the list. If you don't know the history of this game, just go watch the No Clip documentary, it's amazing. But it also clearly establishes that 14 is a love letter to every single one of these other games I mentioned. Yoshida and the team love Final Fantasy. There is absolutely no way they would set out to ruin that. The changes they've made to 16 aren't drastic or crazy attempts to lure a new audience. They're keeping with tradition. And yeah, you may still have the complaint that it's more Game of Thrones than Final Fantasy. And first, I feel like a lot of people are still upset about Game of Thrones. Look, it hurt me too. That ending sucked. But it's still like a loaded phrase. It's akin to calling something the Dark Souls of. There's this connotation that they're not trying to do anything new. They're just trying to copy something else and lure people in. But I still feel like that complaint is off the mark. Like, I don't understand what you mean by that. I don't think you mean fantasy settings. There have been fantasy settings in Final Fantasy games forever. Is that it's trying to be more adult, more mature, have sexual situations, violence, swearing in that fantasy setting? I mean, you probably didn't play or like Final Fantasy Tactics then, because that game is Game of Thrones as shit. And it's not even a mainline game. Adult themes have been part of Final Fantasy for decades. The only difference is, culturally, we're in a place where the average video game player is 30-something. And the developers, and more importantly, the translators who are responsible for making a lot of the previous Final Fantasy games more kid-friendly, they're like, oh, we don't have to hide our adult story under the veneer of teen or kid-friendly anymore. Just some examples off the top of my head. Final Fantasy VI had genocide, suicide, slavery, and much worse, but that's spoilers. 7 literally had a scene where a man tries to rape one or more of the main characters. Hell, there's straight up a story beat about forcing 2 characters into interspecies sex. One of the main themes of 9 is a child coming to terms with life, death, and what any of it's for. Hell, 10 is about the corruption of religion. There are so many examples I couldn't possibly remember all of them or spell them out for you, but I'm sure people in the comments will. And that's what rubs me wrong about all of this. None of it's new. Even the complaints. You don't even have to go far back to see examples of that. When Final Fantasy XII came out, fans thought it was a little too mature and serious compared to 10 and 10-2, which had some mature themes but were presented differently. When 7 came out, sure, it was praised by many people, but at the same time, reviewers would say stuff like, the storytelling is lengthy, involved, and definitely too dialogue heavy for preteen attention spans. There's also swear words and adult situations. Or, but while most Japanese RPGs are happy to adopt an if it's not broke, don't fix it attitude in bringing their titles across from the 16-bit days, Final Fantasy VII has decided to divorce itself almost entirely from its predecessors and tip the whole genre on its head. Look, it's more than okay to not like a game for any number of reasons. If you don't like 16, that's fine. But to say it's not Final Fantasy or leaving fans behind is an insult to the legacy of what these games are. They're all unique. They're all different and willing to try unique and different things. That's what makes them special. So while you may not like the changes they made to this one, like how I didn't like 13, it's still exactly what it has always been. Taking chances, pushing boundaries, and trying to reach a new audience. That's what makes it such a fun franchise. You can be a fan of 8, or 12, or 4, or 6, or 16, or maybe just 7. But I promise you, for the vast majority of fans, even you watching right now, you most likely became a fan because of a risk or change that might have upset another player. But it got you hooked. There is no My Final Fantasy. There's just Final Fantasy. Good, bad, and everything in between.